And the reason it's not going to work is, firstly, the governments cannot create sufficient demand to substitute the consumption demand from individuals and companies. And essentially, the second problem is that there is a very low multiplier effect. Real spending from consumers and from companies, and once the banking system operates and circulates capital, has a multiplier effect. It goes round and round in the economy. The problem is, once you have governments in there, there's almost like a direct transfer system from essentially the government to the producer of the good. It has much slower multipliers. And that actually means that you cannot fully replace one with one. The analogy I've always used is this is like pouring water into a bucket which has a rather large hole down the bottom. So you can't ever really fill up the bucket. So all you're going to do is smooth the process, slow the process. Now, the smoothing the process and slowing the process and to alleviate the worst social consequences is very desirable. However, what they're trying to do is forestall the deleveraging that has to take place, that is counterproductive and sets us up for a disaster down the track.
And therefore, you would, from what you're saying, your assessment of the US has got to be pretty bleak.
Well, I think the assessment of the global economy is generally bleak, and certainly I think there are two problems. In the short term, we're going to see growth effectively collapse, and it's not only in Europe and North America, because as growth collapses there, it's triggering through the export channel a collapse in the Asian and other emerging market exporting economies, which is causing huge problems to those economies because they're smaller, they're less well developed, and they're less able to adjust. So that's the first problem. The second problem is the collapse in demand is setting off what I believe will be a deflationary cycle in the short run. And the deflation means that essentially there is no demand and prices fall. And the problem with that is, under those circumstances, the debt that you have to pay off actually goes up in absolute terms. Because if prices are falling, then the actual debt is actually worth more to somebody on the other side. So it becomes harder and harder to actually pay it back. And essentially you're running on the spot, trying desperately to actually stay in the same place. And as we've seen from places like Japan, that's an extremely difficult process, and the adjustment becomes slow. And this is one of the other reasons the governments around the world are experimenting with quantitative easing, because the theory is if I print enough money, I can create inflation or at least stave off deflation. But my view is because the banking system is broken and there's no circulation of capital and no circulation of credit in the economy, there is not enough velocity of money, not enough circulation to create inflation, at least in the short run. And the second reason I don't think you're going to get inflation in the short run is basically aggregate demand has collapsed and there's oversupply. The only real inflation that may come through is from higher oil prices because they're producing below the cost of production in some cases. And secondly, agricultural prices may actually hold up because there are some shortfalls there. But generally speaking, it's going to be deflationary as well as slow growth, which is the worst of all possible worlds. And I find it difficult to believe the policy actions that are being taken will stave this off.
What about Australia and New Zealand? Because to date, both countries have felt the chill of the recession, but we haven't really seen the dramatic evidence that we've seen overseas. Is this just going to catch up with us inevitably?
I think this is a process of almost trickle down, because what happened is the US basically goes into slowdown, which slows export demand in the economies of China and Asia and the basic exporters around the world, people like Germany. And Australia and New Zealand, to a substantial degree, are suppliers of commodity products to those economies. And essentially what happens under those circumstances is that we are getting the effect of this in the form of a ripple from a storm. So we are lagging to substantial degrees. The second problem is Australia and New Zealand are largely very open economies. And being very open economies, what that means, we are dependent on global trade. And what we're seeing is, for the first time in a very, very long period of time, we're seeing a slowdown in global trade. And I think there is a high risk of global protectionism and financial protectionism. And both Australia and New Zealand are net importers of capital, importers of money. And that's going to become more difficult for them. So I think we will feel the effects, but it will be with something of a lag. And to some extent, that process has started but is not well advanced. And I think for the first time, the Australian government certainly admitted that they could see little way, effectively, of staving off a recession, which is a marked change from what they were saying 3 to 4 months ago, where they were basically saying that there would be no recession here.
So ultimately, could you see governments in this part of the world mirroring what's happening in the Northern Hemisphere in terms of following the same policy approach, quantitative easing, the same sort of formula being applied?
Well, it will depend on how bad things get, but at the moment, certainly both the Australian and the New Zealand government have positive interest rates, so there's still some scope for dropping interest rates, but also some scope for budgetary fiscal stimulation. However, depending on how bad it gets, the policy options of quantitative easing, etc., will obviously have to be things that can't be taken off the table. So it just is a question of how deep the Great Recession actually turns out to be.
If you could give Timothy Geithner one bit of advice right now, I mean, I guess every commentator can criticise what they're doing at the moment, but what should they be doing?
Well, firstly, I would say a couple of things about Timothy Geithner. I think he's been dealt probably the most difficult hand to play. And my view is that's the starting point. He's got a very difficult hand. I have to say he's not playing it particularly well. The thing is that he has to simplify this down into 3 things that have to be fixed. Number 1, the banking system has to be fixed, which essentially means 2 actions. One is you've got to force the banks to write off and recognize the bad loans that are on their books. The second, once you've done that, you have to address the recapitalization issue of the bank. Now, rather than getting hung up on the word nationalization, if that's the only way to actually resuscitate the banking system, it's time to bite the bullet. The second way of doing that would be through some of these bad bank structures or a variety of other measures, but they've got to deal with that. The second thing that they've got to deal with is clearly the fiscal stimulus that they're putting in place is important, but it's got to be properly directed. All this stuff about spending money on infrastructure, which addresses the supply side of the equation and the supply side of the economy, is not what's needed. It's to boost aggregate demand. And that's got to be critical in the whole process. But the last and most important issue to address is a global one. We have to fight 2 things. One, we have to fight global trade protectionism and financial protectionism. And the signs there are very, very ominous. And the second thing is we have to resolve the funding issue for the debtor countries, which need the Chinese, the Japanese, and the creditor countries to lend to them to basically maintain the flow of funds, to enable them to recapitalize the banks and make the fiscal spending possible. That has to be addressed. And what we saw today is very, very ominous from that perspective. The Chinese have put on the table, as I have been saying for the last 18 months they would, a proposal to shift away from the US dollar as the world's only reserve currency. And they put an ambit claim saying they want to go to a synthetic currency. I think the reality is the world will go to a multi-reserve currency system, which is what existed before the 1930s. But the point is the US immediately and categorically basically took that off the agenda. That's clearly not the right way to go about maintaining the flow of global capital, because this is a real issue and this is how we got into the first place. But if people do not want to deal with it, it's not very good in terms of basically trying to resolve the issue. So there has to be a lot of flexibility and a lot of pragmatic thinking rather than ideology. And at the moment, we are nowhere near addressing those issues in either a cohesive, constructive, or sensible way.
That was Sydney-based banking consultant and derivatives trader Satyajit Das speaking to me earlier in the week. And his book, if you're interested, is called Traders, Guns and Money. And that's our program for today. As always, thanks for joining me. Graham Hill with you after the news. I'm Andrew Patterson. Have a very good afternoon.